I'm Zoe Ovens, and I'm a fourth-year student from University of Maryland, and this is joint work with Yiting Huang and Jared Novick. In this poster, we're interested in answering the question of how cognitive control engagement affects the way children process sentences in real time. We know from prior literature that, like adults, children parse sentences incrementally and often fail to revise their initial misanalyses. So, they might misanalyze on the napkin in sentence 1 as a goal and never reanalyze it as a modifier. Similarly, they may misanalyze the DAX in sentence 2 as an agent due to children's agent-first bias and never reanalyze it as a patient to the verb. For adults, engaging participants' cognitive control systems by presenting them with an incongruent Stroop trial right before the sentence makes them better at revising garden path sentences like sentence 1. For children, it makes them worse. So, how can we explain this discrepancy? Here, we test two hypotheses for how engaging cognitive control might be leading to different results for adults and children. Hypothesis 1 is that while engaging cognitive control helps adults ignore subsequent irrelevant sentence interpretations, doing so for children leads to a depletion of control resources, making them worse at subsequent revision. This depletion hypothesis predicts that cognitive control engagement should lower children's performance on sentences like sentence 2 that require revision, but should not affect sentences that do not require revision, such as an active version of sentence 2, the DAX will be quickly chasing the monkey. Here, we argue against this hypothesis and in favor of hypothesis 2. Cognitive control engagement does help children, but only when the cue that led them to the incorrect parse is unreliable. Under this hypothesis, sentences like sentence 1 aren't difficult for children because their control resources are depleted. They're difficult because the initial verb put signals that a location is coming up, and this cue is particularly hard to ignore. This predicts that when children are led down the garden path by a less reliable parsing cue, such as the agent-first bias in sentence 2, cognitive control engagement should actually help them process the sentence more easily. Across 3 studies, we engaged children's cognitive control systems with a child-friendly dog Stroop task and measured the effect of congruent versus incongruent Stroop trials on their comprehension of sentences where the cue that leads children to misparse is the relatively weak agent-first bias. The dog Stroop trials were interleaved with temporally ambiguous active and passive sentences. Prior to the interleave portion, children were trained on the names of congruent and incongruent dogs. Congruent dogs' names matched their fur color, while incongruent dogs' names mismatched their fur color. On sentence trials in Experiment 1, children heard active or passive sentences with novel words, such as, the fur pin will be quickly chasing or chased by the monkey, and had to guess which animal in the display was the fur pin. When children looked to a likely agent in the display, so the big purple guy, we interpreted this as them parsing the sentence as active. When they looked to the likely theme in our display, so the little green guy, we interpreted this as them parsing the sentence as passive. The plots show average looks to the agent versus theme directly after sentence offset. They're plotted so that for all 3 studies, more negative scores are consistent with better active performance and more positive scores are consistent with better passive performance. As you can see, children were always worse at interpreting active sentences after the incongruent Stroop trials, likely because these trials imposed more of a memory burden. We take this as a baseline of how much the incongruent Stroop trials should decrease performance when no revision is required. However, in Experiment 1, where we expect the agent-first bias to be present, we see that the effect is mitigated for passives, suggesting that engaging cognitive control with the incongruent Stroop trials actually helped children overcome the agent-first bias. Experiment 2 replicates the results of Experiment 1 with known animals that had clearer agent-patient relationships and no novel words. Note that the results are similar here. Incongruent Stroop trials impair performance for actives, but not for passives. In Experiment 3, we use the same displays as Experiment 1, but reverse the order of the known and novel nouns. Here, we expected children to not use an agent-first bias, since Huang and Arnold 2016 found that children do not use the agent-first bias for known NP1s in a similar setup with novel nouns. Here, we find that the benefit for passives is gone, and that cognitive control engagement makes children worse at interpreting both active and passive sentences. In sum, we think these results argue against a depletion account, since if cognitive control engagement depletes a finite store of children's cognitive resources, we would have expected them to perform worse across the board at passive sentences that require more revision. Instead, we think these results show us that engaging cognitive control actually helps children to ignore unreliable cues, such as the agent-first bias, during sentence processing.